Late summer, 1944, northern France. The road does not end at the horizon. It only narrows, then disappears into dust and motion. Engines idle, then surge, tires grind against stone. The air smells of fuel, oil, and warm metal. Mile after mile, vehicles move west to east, trucks loaded with crates, fuel tankers with faded stenciling, recovery vehicles towing others already scarred by use. There is no pause, no dramatic announcement, just movement. From a shallow ditch beside the road, a German infantryman watches in silence. He has marched these same roads before, when fuel was scarce and horses pulled what engines could not. He has heard jokes about America, about factories that made refrigerators instead of rifles, about soldiers who would never endure a European winter. Those jokes had traveled easily in 1940. They had felt safe. Now the columns do not stop. They do not thin. They stretch beyond sight, disciplined not by shouting or ceremony, but by schedules and maps. Each truck passes with the same indifference, as if the road itself belongs to them. The infantryman does not laugh anymore. He counts instead, and somewhere between one engine and the next, something settles into place. The understanding that this war is no longer being decided by men alone. In the years before the war, and even in its earliest campaigns, the idea of American military power lived mostly as an abstraction in the minds of German soldiers. For the infantrymen who had crossed into Poland in 1939, then into France in 1940, the war had been decided by speed, discipline, and experience. The armies that mattered were already on the continent. The United States existed across an ocean. Industrial, wealthy, but distant. German military culture had been shaped by scarcity and efficiency. The interwar Reich had rebuilt its armed forces under material constraints, forced to innovate through doctrine rather than abundance. The Wehrmacht emphasized maneuver, coordination, and operational tempo precisely because it could not rely on endless reserves. This reality fostered a quiet pride. German soldiers were trained to believe they could do more with less, and for several years, that belief seemed justified. In 1940, when France fell in 6 weeks, American observers were still debating rearmament budgets. In German barracks and frontline rest areas, jokes circulated easily. America was a nation of assembly lines and consumer goods. Its factories made cars with chrome and refrigerators with rounded corners. Its people, so the jokes went, were soft and familiar with deprivation and tested by European war. The infantryman repeated these lines not because he had studied America, but because the war so far had rewarded confidence. The early military record of the United States did little to challenge these assumptions. Its army was small by European standards in 1939. Much of its equipment was outdated. Training exercises revealed weaknesses in coordination and doctrine. German intelligence assessments before 1941 consistently ranked American ground forces as inexperienced and unprepared for continental warfare. For the soldier at the front, this confirmed what he already believed. Even after December 1941, when the United States formally entered the war, the distance remained psychological as much as geographic. In North Africa, German units initially encountered American forces with mixed results. Early engagements exposed American inexperience, reinforcing existing prejudices. German after-action reports noted poor coordination and tactical errors. These observations traveled faster than nuance. The infantryman heard only the conclusion. America did not yet know how to fight. But beneath these surface impressions, something else was already in motion, something that did not announce itself on the battlefield. While German factories worked under increasing strain, vulnerable to bombing and dependent on limited raw materials, American industry was undergoing a transformation of scale unprecedented in modern history. This transformation was not dramatic in the way battles were dramatic. It did not produce headlines at the front, it produced numbers. By 1942, the United States had reorganized its economy around total war. civilian production was converted, standardized, and synchronized. Automobile plants became tank and truck factories. Shipyards expanded along both coasts. Rail networks were prioritized for military transport. Crucially, this industrial shift was planned not only to produce weapons, but to move them across continents, across oceans, and eventually across the roads of Europe itself. German soldiers did not see this yet. What they saw were still shortages. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition was counted carefully. Vehicles were repaired repeatedly because replacements were uncertain. Horses remained essential for transport in many infantry divisions. This was normal. It had always been this way. The contrast, when it came, would not arrive as a single revelation. It would arrive incrementally, first as rumors, then as reports, and finally as sight. The infantrymen would begin to notice that enemy units did not pause for lack of supply. That roads once contested now flowed steadily with traffic. That destruction did not interrupt movement for long. Something was sustaining this enemy advance beyond tactics or courage. At first, the explanation seemed simple: numbers, more men, more machines. But numbers alone could not explain the rhythm, the precision with which material appeared where it was needed, when it was needed. This was not improvisation. It was design, and as German forces were pushed back across France, retreating along the same roads they had once advanced, the infantryman would come to understand that the war he was fighting had expanded beyond the battlefield. It had become a contest between systems, one strained and finite, the other vast and still accelerating. That realization would only deepen as the columns grew longer. What separated American power from previous industrial efforts was not merely output, but integration. By 1942, war production in the United States was no longer measured only in tanks or aircraft. It was measured in flow. Steel became vehicles. Vehicles became movement. Movement became pressure, constant, predictable, and scalable. The American industrial system had been built in peacetime to solve problems of distance. Consumer markets demanded that goods move efficiently across a continent. That logic translated seamlessly into war. When factories converted to military production, they inherited not only machinery, but an entire culture of logistics, standardized parts, interchangeable components, and schedules designed to minimize delay. A truck produced in Michigan was expected to function identically to one produced in California. This assumption shaped everything that followed. By contrast, German production was fragmented. Multiple models performed similar roles. Spare parts varied. Repair units improvised constantly. This flexibility had advantages early in the war, but it could not compete with volume paired with uniformity. American planners understood that the battlefield would punish inconsistency. Their answer was repetition on a massive scale. The numbers were stark. By 1943, American factories were producing tens of thousands of trucks annually. These were not glamorous weapons. They did not appear in propaganda posters with heroic framing. Yet they formed a skeleton of Allied operations. Every advance required fuel. Every unit required food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. The American response was not to ration ambition, but to industrialize it. This philosophy extended to training and doctrine. American logisticians planned offensives backwards, starting from supply requirements and calculating what was possible based on delivery capacity. Roads, ports, and railheads became strategic objectives. Engineers followed closely behind combat units, repairing bridges and clearing routes with practice speed. The goal was not simply to move forward, but to ensure that forward movement never stalled. German intelligence gradually became aware of this shift, but awareness did not equal comprehension. Reports noted increased vehicle density. Aerial reconnaissance showed expanding depots. Prisoner interrogations referenced abundant supplies. Yet within the German system, these details struggled to change entrenched assumptions. The idea that an enemy could sustain such momentum indefinitely conflicted with European experience. Wars, it was believed, exhausted economies. They imposed limits. But the American economy had been mobilized not to endure strain, but to absorb it. Its industrial base was geographically insulated from bombing. Its access to raw materials was secure. Its labor force expanded rather than contracted. Losses in equipment were treated not as crises, but as variables to be replaced. As Allied forces prepared for operations in Western Europe, this logic reached its full expression. The planning for invasion assumed enormous consumption rates: fuel burned per mile, ammunition expended per division per day, vehicles lost to wear rather than combat. These figures were not optimistic, they were conservative. American planners assumed failure at the margins and compensated with surplus. For the German infantryman, none of this was visible on paper. What he encountered instead were effects. Roads clogged not with refugees or retreating units, but with enemy traffic moving with purpose. Supply dumps appeared overnight. Destroyed bridges were bypassed or repaired with speed that defied expectation. Even when Allied units paused, the pause felt deliberate rather than forced. The war, from his perspective, had changed character. Earlier campaigns had been decided by decisive moments, breakthroughs, encirclements, collapses. Now the pressure felt continuous. There was no obvious point of exhaustion on the enemy side. Each withdrawal revealed another prepared line, another wave of material, another layer of support. This was not simply a matter of industrial capacity. It was the visible manifestation of a system designed to turn distance into advantage. The Atlantic Ocean, once assumed to be a barrier, had become a conduit. What arrived on European shores did not trickle. It accumulated, and as German forces retreated deeper into the continent, the infantryman began to understand that the columns he saw were not temporary. They were not the surge of a single offensive. They were the outward expression of an economy that had learned how to fight by moving unceasingly, methodically, and at a scale that no European power had ever witnessed. That understanding would soon be tested from every angle of the war itself. Human angle, the infantryman's disbelief. For a German soldier on the roads of France in 1944, the scale of Allied logistics was more than numbers, it was a psychological shock. He had trained under the assumption that wars ended when material and men ran out. He had marched into France in 1940, confident that speed and tactical skill could overcome shortages. Now, months into the retreat, he witnessed a different reality. Columns of trucks moved without pause. Fuel and food followed the same rhythm as bullets and artillery shells. Soldiers who had once joked about American softness now faced it in full motion, tire tracks stretching beyond sight, the hum of engines a constant reminder of production, far larger than any battlefield engagement. Letters from home could not explain it. Reports from higher command could not soften it. Morale shifted subtly, from confidence to disbelief, as men struggled to reconcile their assumptions with the evidence on the roads. This human response was not immediate panic, but a creeping realization. The infantryman measured each mile, counting trucks, estimating supplies, sensing the inexhaustible pulse behind every movement. He could no longer laugh. Laughter had been a shield. Now, it was replaced by a cold calculation. If this continues, how can we resist? Human endurance was finite. The enemy's industry, it seemed, was not. Tactical angle, movement as battlefield dominance, the sight of endless columns, was more than a morale challenge, it had direct tactical implications. Roads once contested by ambushes and patrols now became arteries for Allied operations. Artillery could be resupplied in hours rather than days. Infantry divisions advanced with confidence, knowing that any loss of vehicles or weapons could be replaced almost immediately. German commanders noted that where once slow progress favored defensive operations, the speed and reliability of American logistics allowed for continuous offensives. Every vehicle on the road represented more than fuel or ammunition. It represented flexibility, redundancy, and strategic depth. Defensive positions that might have forced a pause were now bypassed, reinforced, or overwhelmed by sheer material momentum. The battlefield had expanded to include infrastructure itself. Control of ports, railways, and highways became as decisive as any engagement. Tactical plans were no longer limited to what could be executed with existing men and weapons. They now had to consider the flow of enemy supply, which was effectively inexhaustible at operational scales. Technological angle, vehicles, standardization, and efficiency. American trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks were not exotic weapons, they were mundane instruments of systematic dominance. Their significance lay in uniformity. Every tire, every engine, every spare part was interchangeable, simplifying repairs and maintenance in the field. Where German units relied on improvisation and cannibalization, American mechanics operated with predictability and speed. Fuel distribution was equally revolutionary. Tankers traveled alongside combat units, supported by a network of pipelines and storage depots that minimized downtime. Mechanical reliability allowed for extended operations without retreating to rear depots. By standardizing vehicles, parts, and repair procedures, the United States transformed what might have been a logistical headache into a strategic weapon. It was a silent, invisible force that German infantry could sense, but not easily quantify. Even minor equipment, motorcycles for reconnaissance, pontoon bridges, and mobile repair units functioned within this integrated system. The sum of these components was far greater than the individual parts, a river of material moving west to east, reshaping every engagement it touched. The consequences of these human, tactical, and technological factors were cumulative. Disbelief, operational flexibility, and mechanical reliability converged to create a battlefield reality that German infantry had never encountered. What had been assumed impossible and limited material pressure was now occurring on roads, fields, and villages across northern France. Misjudgments and delayed recognition. German commanders at both divisional and army levels struggled to interpret the scale of American industrial power. Early intelligence reports underestimated output. Aerial reconnaissance noted the volume of trucks and vehicles, but failed to translate that into operational consequences. Many officers still assumed that Allied advances were limited by human endurance, rather than sustained by a continuous supply chain. High Command memos from 1944 reveal repeated frustration at the inability to halt American momentum. Some generals advocated aggressive counterattacks, expecting shortages to force pauses. Others sought to concentrate defenses along rivers or choke points, underestimating the speed with which fuel, vehicles, and engineer units could bypass obstacles. Decisions were based on pre-war models of warfare, attrition, exhaustion, and predictable limits. In practice, the US system operated beyond these parameters. Leadership misjudgments were not due to incompetence, but to a structural blind spot. Europe had never faced an industrial opponent of this scale. For the infantryman, the result was a dissonance between orders and reality. He was told to hold a village or delay a column, yet the material arriving behind the Americans often rendered defensive positions obsolete. Confusion filtered down the chain of command, leaving frontline units to improvise while struggling to understand the logistical adversary that seemed limitless. The German perspective on the invisible force to the German soldier. The American logistical system was almost mythical. Prisoners described supply dumps appearing overnight. Convoys that should have been exhausted continued to flow with precision. Engineers repaired bridges faster than they could be destroyed. To infantrymen, it seemed as though the enemy's advance was powered not by men alone, but by some invisible, inexhaustible force. This perception influenced both morale and tactical reasoning. Units began to expect that resistance would eventually be overcome, regardless of valor or discipline. Even when local victories were achieved, ambushes, destroyed convoys, temporary roadblocks, the effect on the campaign was negligible. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once, present on the roads, in depots, in the air, and yet abstract, faceless, and unrelenting. The psychological weight of this perception cannot be overstated. Human beings measure threat in terms they understand: men, guns, ammunition. When faced with a system operating beyond familiar constraints, fear becomes layered with helplessness. German accounts frequently note phrases like inexhaustible or endless, capturing the visceral response of infantry, confronted by overwhelming logistics. The weight of scale as American columns stretched across France. The effect on German morale was cumulative. The individual soldier faced a paradox. Every tactical engagement could be won, yet the broader strategic situation seemed unassailable. Exhaustion and frustration replaced earlier confidence. Men who had once joked about American softness now contemplated the consequences of sustained industrial might. This psychological burden was compounded by the predictability of movement. Unlike a chaotic or uneven enemy advance, American logistics were consistent. Supplies arrived reliably. Vehicles did not tire. Roads remained open. The Wehrmacht had relied for years on disruption, ambushes, supply shortages, attrition to slow an opponent. The Americans did not offer those vulnerabilities. They neutralized the familiar tools of delay, leaving German soldiers to confront both material and moral challenges simultaneously. The infantryman's view of the war changed from one of tactical skill to a recognition of systemic inevitability. Resistance was no longer just a matter of courage or leadership. It was also a matter of confronting the scale of an industrial machine that had learned to fight by moving, and to move without pause. The interplay of leadership misjudgment, the perception of an unstoppable enemy, and the psychological weight of unrelenting material pressure set the stage for the decisive moments to come. What had been abstract American industry was now a tangible, overwhelming force, reshaping both strategy and human experience along the roads of France. The Western Front. For the German infantryman, the moment of reckoning came on the long roads between Caen and Paris. Once, he had moved with confidence, believing that time, terrain, and tactical cunning could shape outcomes. Now, every mile of retreat revealed another layer of material inevitability. Columns of trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks stretched like rivers of steel. Artillery pieces followed on their own wheels, supplies stacked with geometric precision. Fuel tankers moved in constant flow, their numbers uncountable by any single observer. Bridges, bombed only hours before, were already repaired by engineer units that seemed to appear from nowhere. October 1944 brought the Battle of the Aachen Corridor. German divisions, dug into fortified positions, faced Allied units advancing with relentless consistency. For every defensive line, a new wave of vehicles brought replacements, ammunition, and food. Engineers repaired roads faster than demolition teams could destroy them. What had once been a pause, a chance to regroup, no longer existed. The Americans' operational tempo was dictated not by chance, but by an industrial heartbeat that the Wehrmacht could neither match nor interrupt. Frontline reports note bewilderment. Units counted trucks, attempting to estimate how long the advance could continue. Their calculations failed. For every vehicle destroyed, 3 more arrived within hours. Supplies flowed in a cycle synchronized with movement, reinforcing the psychological impression that the enemy could never be exhausted. For the German soldier, the battlefield was no longer a contest of skill alone. It was a confrontation with an economy in motion. In the air above, tactical reconnaissance flights confirmed what the infantrymen already sensed. Road networks across northern France were clogged with Allied convoys. Depots brimming with food, ammunition, and fuel were strategically dispersed to prevent disruption. The scale of the operation was staggering. Entire divisions could move hundreds of miles without pause, their logistical tale a visible testament to American planning and production. The key realization came at Le Mans, where retreating German forces encountered supply nodes feeding multiple corps simultaneously. Bridges spanned rivers that had once slowed every army. Road repair units worked with a precision honed by industrial standards, not battlefield improvisation. Infantrymen witnessed firsthand that their traditional tools ambush, sabotage, tactical cunning had limits against an opponent whose strength was continuous and quantifiable movement. By November, the US First Army and Third Army were advancing toward the German border. Operational pauses were rare. Each unit, whether infantry, armor, or artillery, arrived at the front with a predictability that forced German commanders into reactive planning. The battlefield was no longer a series of isolated engagements. It was an extended, interconnected system in which the supply lines themselves dictated tempo. German soldiers, who had once laughed at the idea of American industry, now faced the tangible reality of its unstoppable expression. Every mile, every village passed, reinforced the same lesson. The war was no longer fought on skill alone. It was fought on roads, in depots, in maintenance sheds, and on fuel pipelines. American industry had become the battlefield itself, and the infantry could only observe as its relentless columns pressed westward, reshaping France with an unyielding rhythm. By late November 1944, the full weight of American logistics was undeniable. The German army, once confident in its ability to dictate the tempo of retreat or defense, found that its calculations no longer aligned with reality. Entire divisions moved in a measured rhythm, synchronized with the continuous delivery of vehicles, fuel, and ammunition. Roads became the arteries of power, every bridge and junction a critical node in a living, breathing network. Delay was nearly impossible. The city of Metz exemplified the turning point. German defenders held fortified positions, prepared for siege. They had counted on attrition to slow the American advance. Fuel shortages, vehicle breakdowns, and supply bottlenecks, none occurred. American engineers repaired destroyed roads overnight. Convoys arrived on schedule, resupplied units, and kept the offensive rolling. Artillery barrages could be maintained indefinitely. Infantry units could rotate forward without reducing pressure. Where once German soldiers had been able to predict pauses, now they were confronted with unceasing motion. Simultaneously, American intelligence and planning amplified the effect of industrial might. Reconnaissance data allowed commanders to deploy forces efficiently, anticipating German positions while maintaining momentum. Supply and combat operations were intertwined. There was no separation between production, transportation, and deployment. For the German infantrymen, the battlefield had changed from a series of discrete confrontations into a vast, continuous system, operating according to industrial precision rather than battlefield chance. December 1944 brought the initial reports of the endless columns from soldiers and officers alike. Unit diaries described truck after truck, half-track after half-track, all moving in unbroken lines. Ammunition and fuel arrived in volumes that made every previous assumption about resupply obsolete. Even elite German formations could not stem the tide. Defensive strategies faltered because material advantage dictated operational success. The concept of exhaustion, the familiar limiter of warfare, had been rendered irrelevant. The cumulative impact was decisive. German units were forced into reactive positions, abandoning key territory, be because of immediate combat losses, but because supply shortages could not be exploited against an enemy whose own logistics were inexhaustible. By January 1945, as Allied armies pressed into eastern France and toward the Rhine, the war had shifted fundamentally. The infantrymen understood that the conflict was no longer between armies of men alone. It was between men and an industrial colossus that never slept, never paused, and never erred in its basic calculations. Every defensive line crumbled faster than expected. Tactical brilliance could delay, but it could not stop the systematic pressure of an economy in motion. The war, at this stage, was no longer fought purely by combat, but by material dominance expressed through movement. The infantryman's disbelief had matured into resignation. The scale of the American logistical machine was beyond resistance, and as the Western Front solidified under Allied pressure, the consequences of this relentless industrial advance would ripple far beyond the battlefield, shaping the final months of the war in Europe. By early 1945, the consequences of the American logistical surge were evident in both numbers and outcomes. German forces, once able to predict pauses in combat, found themselves in constant retreat. Roads from northern France to the German border were clogged with retreating units, abandoned equipment, and exhausted men. Every defensive position held only briefly, overwhelmed not necessarily by combat losses, but by the relentless rhythm of Allied supply and movement. Statistical records highlight the disparity. U.S. Army production in 1944 had reached staggering levels: over 500,000 trucks, 88,000 tanks, and 12 million tons of vehicles and supplies shipped to the European theater. Fuel consumption alone exceeded 20 million gallons per month, yet supplies never ran dry at the front. For the German soldier, the battlefield became a constant reminder that every action would be countered not only by men and weapons, but by a material tide he could neither anticipate nor stop. Infantry diaries describe abandoned villages littered with German trucks, motorcycles, and artillery pieces. Many were disabled only temporarily, engine failure, low fuel, but were rapidly replaced by subsequent American convoys. Repair teams followed closely behind the front, ensuring that damaged vehicles re-entered the operational chain with minimal delay. What had once been a decisive pause, a chance for defense or regrouping, no longer existed. Supply was not just abundant, it was continuous, adaptive, and synchronized to the flow of combat. The effect on German strategic calculations was profound. Commanders recognized that attrition strategies, previously effective in slowing the enemy, were now insufficient. Every delay they attempted to impose was offset by an overwhelming, predictable resupply. Intelligence reports emphasized the scale of the logistical system, noting that the Americans could field operational strength faster than the Germans could reinforce or reorganize. German divisions on the Western Front shrank in operational capacity, not always due to casualties, but due to the sheer inability to meet the demands of a mechanized, supplied opponent. In addition, morale suffered. Soldiers who had trained to rely on skill, initiative, and improvisation faced an enemy whose advantage was structural, not individual. The realization that the Americans could continuously sustain operations even in adverse weather, across destroyed infrastructure, and under constant threat from German counterattacks created a pervasive sense of inevitability. For many infantrymen, the laughter once directed at American industry had long disappeared, replaced by a quiet, tense awareness of their limits in the face of a relentless, machine-like force. The battlefield itself bore testament to this transformation. Roads remained clogged with Allied vehicles for weeks. Depots, once considered temporary storage, became permanent hubs of operational power. Even local populations noted the scale. Towns saw hundreds of trucks pass in single days, often carrying supplies for divisions yet to arrive. The impression of endless motion was no exaggeration. It was a direct, visible manifestation of the industrial and logistical effort that had reshaped the course of the war in Europe. The broader implications of this logistical dominance became increasingly apparent as 1945 progressed. German forces, stretched across multiple fronts, were forced to abandon territory, only because of enemy combat effectiveness, but because supply lines had been effectively neutralized by sheer volume. Key towns and strategic positions were surrendered not after decisive battles, but because American columns, carrying everything from fuel to spare parts, ensured that every offensive could continue without interruption. The enemy's operational endurance had become inexhaustible in ways the German High Command had never anticipated. Post-war analyses confirm this shift. The US Army's logistical throughput during the Western European campaign dwarfed the German capacity. For every vehicle the Germans could field, 3 American trucks were in operation, moving men, weapons, and supplies to the front. Entire corps could be resupplied, repositioned, and reinforced, while German units struggled merely to maintain cohesion. Reports from German commanders, preserved in diaries and captured documents, repeatedly describe encounters with unending lines, mountains of fuel, and supplies that seem to appear from nowhere. The language is consistent, the scale of movement itself was decisive. The consequences extended beyond immediate combat. German soldiers, now constantly confronted with an enemy that seemed to operate outside the limits of ordinary warfare, began to internalize a sense of inevitability. Exhaustion and resignation replaced aggressive initiative. Even skilled commanders found that local successes had minimal strategic effect. What mattered increasingly was not individual valor or tactical ingenuity, but the ability or inability to cope with the enemy's overwhelming material superiority. At the operational level, this meant a shift in German strategy. Defensive lines, once effective through attrition and terrain, became temporary obstacles, delays rather than true impediments. The Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, illustrated the stakes. Even a meticulously planned German counterattack could not be sustained against an opponent whose production and movement networks absorbed losses and replaced units faster than the Germans could exploit weaknesses. The cumulative effect on the Western Front was decisive. Allied forces pushed relentlessly toward the Rhine, liberated towns and cities with mechanical precision, and inflicted losses that were simultaneously tactical, logistical, and psychological. German infantrymen recorded in letters and memoirs the profound astonishment of encountering never-ending columns. Their earlier mockery of American industry had turned into a muted acknowledgement of its power. The war had shifted, quietly but irreversibly, from contests of skill and courage to a confrontation with industrial scale itself. The stage was now set for the final months of the conflict. The American logistical machine, once abstract in German minds, had become the backbone of Allied victory, demonstrating that in modern war, the ability to move material effectively could determine outcomes as decisively as any battle. The image of endless trucks rolling across France lingers long after the last shots are fired. For the German infantryman, the war became less a contest of individual courage or tactical genius, and more a confrontation with a force he could not touch, the relentless, organized motion of industry itself. Every mile of road, every repaired bridge, every convoy carried a lesson in scale, precision, and human ingenuity harnessed to steel and fuel. This moment revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Victory is no longer determined solely by valor or strategy. It can be determined by the capacity to produce, transport, and sustain. The Americans had transformed logistics into a weapon, invisible yet decisive, reshaping the battlefield before bullets were even fired. For the men on the ground, the sight of these columns was a silent but undeniable signal. Wars can be won without ever meeting the enemy in a pitched battle, if material power flows unbroken. Beyond the tactical and operational implications, there is a human lesson. The awe, disbelief, and eventual resignation of the infantrymen speak to the limits of perception. One can laugh at the abstract notion of an opponent's strength, but only when confronted with its tangible manifestation does comprehension and humility arrive. Industry, in this sense, becomes both shield and sword, shaping the fate of nations while remaining faceless. Ultimately, the endless columns across France were more than movement. They were the embodiment of modern war itself. They remind us that human conflict is intertwined with human invention, that the invisible architecture of supply can weigh as heavily on the outcome as the sharpest blade or the most disciplined regiment. And in that realization lies a quiet, enduring truth. The war had been decided, not only by soldiers and generals, but by the capacity of a nation to move relentlessly toward victory.